Captain Adolfo de la Hoz was a Spanish pilot who gave an interview in 1999 after participating in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. De la Hoz went against the public narrative from NATO and the US that they were avoiding civilian targets, saying that NATO was awarding pilots who bombed civilian targets with medals. He said the majority, if not all of his colleagues, were against the war in Yugoslavia, or at least the barbarity of the bombings. He said that multiple times his colonel protested to NATO commanders after being instructed to bomb civilian targets. But he was rudely dismissed and told that protesting would anger the North Americans. And after outright refusing to cluster bomb 2 civilian targets, the colonel was transferred by higher-ups. And of course, this pilot's testimony contradicts NATO's public narrative about the bombings. Before, during, and after the bombings, NATO officials said that civilian casualties were unintentional and unavoidable. But de la Hoz says this is a lie and there was no effort to avoid civilians. And he said there were so many lies in the press at this time that he and the other pilots decided to stop reading newspapers until they returned home. He said no journalist has the slightest idea what's happening in Yugoslavia. They, NATO, are destroying the country, bombing it with novel weapons, toxic nerve gases, surface mines, parachute bombs containing uranium, black napalm, sterilization chemicals, spraying poison gas on crops. NATO Commander General Wesley Clark said that the goal of the aerial assault was to destroy Yugoslavia's essential infrastructure. And that's what they did by bombing 15 cities in Kosovo around the clock for 2 months straight, filling the water, soil, and air with toxicity while targeting power plants, farms, and water sanitation facilities. In 1999, Bill Clinton went on TV to address the bombings. He praised the American pilots who risked their lives to drop these bombs despite the fact that the US suffered 0 casualties, and he said the bombings would allow Albanians to return home to Kosovo, bringing new hope to oppressed people everywhere. Except more Albanians fled Kosovo during the time of the bombings than any other time, and most of the international community was appalled by NATO's horrific bombings. Serbian paramilitaries, who the US was supposed to be targeting, increased their attacks during the bombings, as did the KLA, the Albanian separatist terrorist group which was armed and financed by the US. This is why you can't trust the US when they say we need to bomb somewhere in order to help them. Because the solution that the US and NATO come up with, which is often bombing, is never intended to be a real solution. It's intended to protect the US's economic interests and make people think we need to do it for human rights. During the bombings of Yugoslavia, a coalition of international law professors submitted charges of war crimes against NATO. It was submitted to a tribunal which was created by Madeleine Albright and was financed by NATO. The charges were dismissed, and the tribunal chose to never investigate, although they quickly indicted the US's enemy, Milosevic, creating the pretext for the bombings. This international law is kind of BS when all the institutions of power are run by wealthy capitalists and oligarchs.